let us consider what it is that war actually accomplishes versus what it is purported to accomplish. Very often the justification for wars is stated as retaliation against aggression, deposition of an evil regime, perhaps a justified claim to a territory or to certain resources, perhaps retribution for certain past offenses. However, what actually happens in war is not the righting of an abstract or concrete but very general geopolitical wrong. Rather, what happens in war is a myriad of particular sufferings. Sufferings by people who did not cause these abstract or very generalized wrongs on the basis of which the wars are supposed to be fought. The wars are fought between the young people of one country or one ethnicity and the young people of another country or ethnicity. These young people did not initiate the conflicts on the basis of which the war is being fought. Indeed, if these young people had met one another in any different context, they might have been good friends. But because of the delusions, I would argue, of the leaders in charge, these young men are forced to take up weapons and shoot one another. Who else suffers in wars? Civilians, on both sides, even in countries that aren't directly affected by wars. Every war has an economic impact. Every war drains resources that could otherwise have been used in peaceful production. I'm not saying that the government should appropriate those resources and use them in civilian social programs. I am saying that the people should keep these resources for themselves. I am saying that they should construct with those resources new buildings, factories, research centers, libraries, not use those resources for carnage and destruction. And of course, the carnage and destruction of war are obvious, but perhaps their effects are not so obvious for many people. Those same buildings and research facilities and factories are also destroyed in mass during war. Vital infrastructure is obliterated, taking certain parts of the world back in time, 50, 100 years, perhaps even back to the Dark Ages, so that people need to start over in rebuilding the basic infrastructure of civilization. And are those people in any way to blame for the supposed wrongs on the basis of which the wars are being fought? It does not seem to be the case. Now, whom are the wars intended to target? Just as whom are various economic sanctions, trade embargoes, other protectionist measures intended to target? They are intended to target the offending leaders of the other country. But whom do they end up targeting? They end up targeting the civilians, the people whom those offending leaders also oppress. And now their oppression is further magnified by these retaliatory measures. Now surely there needs to be a way to punish oppressive leaders. But war, this indiscriminate use of hundreds of thousands of young men to fight and kill tens and hundreds of thousands of other young men, is not the solution. The solution should be much more targeted, much more discriminating, much more precise. It is the difference between firebombing a city and assassinating or capturing only the leader of the country or organization that has initiated aggression and some of that leader's most virulent, sadistic supporters. There is an immense difference here. The latter, I do not believe, requires a declaration of war, nor should it require the involvement of the population or even the country abstractly defined. On the subject of who suffers in war, there is an excellent essay by Desiderius Erasmus, a late 15th and early 16th century Renaissance humanist philosopher who was many, many centuries ahead of his time. The essay is titled Antipolemus, or the Plea of Reason, Religion, and Humanity Against War, and I have linked to it in the references section accompanying this presentation. This essay explores in extremely affecting prose who it is that is actually most significantly set back by war, and it is not the leaders. It is people like you and me. Even here in the United States now, our tax burdens, both present and future, are going to be significantly magnified as a result of the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq. Now, what about the extreme case that many proponents of war will bring forth? What about a case of obvious self-defense where another regime has sent troops to occupy the soil of one's country. Is it then not justified to assemble an army and fight back? I would argue that while fighting back as such may be justified in individual cases, a war, as officially defined, as organized by a government, by a centralized authority, would not be justified. What the government of the occupied country should do instead is focus all of its energies against the leaders of the invading regime. Instead of senselessly killing the rank-and-file troops who have not made the decision to invade, who are simply following orders, why not develop an approach that involves targeted assassinations of the people who masterminded this invasion and this occupation, and meanwhile keep the civilian population out of it. Encourage the civilian population to take shelter, to maybe even flee the country. Certainly this is a much more sensible approach if one is thinking about protecting one's family and one's life and even one's livelihood. The truth is that most people do not have the skills to effectively resist an invading enemy. And moreover, if they were herded into a centralized military force organized from the top down, they would essentially be cannon fodder. Now, if some individuals wish to resist the invasion on their own initiative, say as part of a guerrilla troop, I would have no objection to that. I believe it is the sovereign right of every individual to own and carry firearms, even though I do not myself. And it is the sovereign right of every individual to use these firearms to resist genuine invasions of his life, liberty, and property. However, for most individuals, the most prudent course of action would be to remove themselves from the conflict and to allow individuals who are optimally trained to do so to provide targeted resistance against the leaders of the invasion. Imagine if the troops that are currently being used as rank-and-file infantrymen were instead trained to be commandos who would go in and whose sole mission would be to take out the leaders. And that would end the war. Why is it that the ordinary, peaceful, productive population of both countries needs to suffer, and the politicians and demagogues who incite these wars get away without any penalty whatsoever? Indeed, it would be a just and rather amusing situation if geopolitical disagreements of any sort were settled not by the people of the countries involved, but rather by their leaders in one-on-one duels. Let's put George W. Bush in a cage with Saddam Hussein and see who wins. And then the conflict would be resolved. And it would be universally agreed that whoever wins the conflict would be able to essentially have his way. Of course, as regards the conflict, and not the fates of the civilian population, to whom such squabbles between leaders ought to be entirely irrelevant. As someone who believes in continuing and accelerating progress of human civilization, I find war to be perhaps the most incredibly regressive and destructive and anti-civilizational activity that could be imagined. At no time in human history has there been such massive destruction of infrastructure as during the 2 world wars. And I do not believe that this should ever recur again. But in order to avoid its recurrence once again, we need to avoid being tempted into explanations for particular wars that might seem just or moral or effective to us, because in its very nature, war cannot be anything but destructive and conducive of some of the greatest misery that is to be found as a consequence of human conduct.